Good morning, everybody. We'll get started in a couple of minutes. Hey, everyone, just going to give people one more minute to join.
think it's slowed down a bit.
All right, we will get started. So welcome everybody to the 7th meeting of the Stakeholder Group for the Performance-Based Regulation Study. We'll move on to our next slide and show all the different organizations that are participating. So again, we won't do any introductions. We'll just ask that as you unmute to speak, if you give us your name and your affiliation. So next we'll get to our agenda for today. And one change from this agenda, we had a speaker on carbon leakage, had a late scheduling conflict, so we'll now have that presentation at our final meeting. So today we will hear from RMI to give us an evaluation of the current performance mechanisms in the Virginia code. That came from a request a couple of meetings ago. We'll also discuss or we'll have a presentation on some potential PBR reforms in Virginia from Clean Virginia and Synapse Energy. Then we will have an open discussion on the regulation of competitive service providers, as that's one aspect of the resolution we haven't really touched too much upon thus far. And then we'll close it up. The SCC's experts, Great Plains Institute and Current Energy Group, will be present for kind of a final Q&A as everybody's working through that final comment exercise, that assessment sheet we provided, just if any sort of technical questions have come up or anything you want to know about how PBR has worked elsewhere that might inform your final comments. There'll just be an open Q&A to give you a chance to ask those questions. So to start today, we'll move over to RMI, and this assessment of the current performance mechanisms in the Commonwealth. This came from a request in our 5th meeting to have one of the experts that has been participating in the stakeholder group with us provide that evaluation of the existing performance-based mechanisms in the Virginia structure, and then provide also some comparison of how those compare to what's been happening in other states. So from RMI, we have Janelle Wilson and Oliver Tully, and I'll hand over to them. You should be able to share from your side.
Great, thank you. Give me just a sec to share my screen. All right, is that coming through okay?
It is, thanks.
Okay. Thank you very much for having us. My name is Oliver Tully. I'm here with Janelle Wilson. We work on the electricity team at RMI. RMI is a nonprofit that provides research and technical assistance on a range of energy and regulatory issues. Today, we're going to be giving a high-level overview of our perspective on some key regulatory mechanisms in place in Virginia and comparing them to what we've seen elsewhere in states that are working towards implementation of a PBR framework. I'll also note that we have completed our own assessment of the Word doc template, and we've sent that over to Larry and the team, and I think that should be available to the stakeholders soon. And that provides a lot more detail beyond what we're going to be able to talk about today. We'll be speaking for about 20 minutes or so and moving through topics somewhat quickly, but then we'll have time for some Q&A. I'll also flag that we are very happy to share more resources afterwards that'll have more information. If there's anything that we're not able to address today, either through the slides that we have prepared or the Q&A. And one final note before we begin, we won't be able to cover every topic that was in that assessment template, but we're just going to focus on a number of key categories that we think are important to address, and I've listed those here on the slide. Okay, to start with rate reviews overall, as you're all aware, Virginia has a 2-year rate cycle, and what we've seen is that frequent rate cases can undermine cost containment goals and significantly increase administrative burdens. In states that are moving towards PBR, there is a trend towards adopting multi-year rate plans. These can offer strong cost containment incentives depending on how they're designed. MRPs generally have a 3 to 5 year plan term where there's a stay out period between rate cases. And by increasing the time between rate reviews and using a variety of cost recovery mechanisms, multi-year rate plans can be more streamlined and they can create a stronger cost containment incentive compared to standard rate review practices. While there are a number of ways to design multi-year rate plans, they generally include a mechanism that caps revenues and adjusts them over time to reflect changes in costs. If a utility is able to achieve cost savings during the plan term, they can retain a portion of those savings, creating an incentive for cost containment. We've also seen that multi-year rate plans can be designed with strong guardrails to course correct when necessary. For example, at times of excessive over-earnings or a credit downgrade, for example. And there are a relatively large number of states that currently have an MRP, and a few in particular that use what are called externally indexed attrition relief mechanisms to adjust rates over time include Hawaii, Massachusetts, and Alberta, Canada. In terms of those guardrails, earnings sharing mechanism can serve that function. Virginia does have an ESM in place, which provides some affordability protections for customers in terms of sharing over earnings. And in general, we see that strong earnings sharing mechanisms are structured so that they act as a safeguard if utility earnings significantly exceed authorized ROE. And especially when paired with multi-year rate plans, are considering how any requirements for earnings sharing may be diluting the cost containment incentive that MRPs provide. So in general, incentivizing cost containment while also pursuing earnings sharing is a balancing act. And we've seen that states that implement MRPs as part of a larger PBR framework closely consider how the ESM fits into that framework. Deadbands can be used to preserve cost containment incentives, but without either a revenue cap through an MRP or revenue decoupling, which we'll get into in a second. If a utility earns a higher ROE, it can be unclear whether that's the result of a utility reducing costs overall or just increasing sales. So what we've seen in other states is that a deadband by itself may not be as effective as when combined with these other mechanisms. And Hawaii, Massachusetts, and Vermont are a few notable examples of robust ESMs. In terms of revenue decoupling, Virginia has gas revenue decoupling in place, but does not have electric decoupling. And decoupling trues up a utility's actual revenue with allowed revenue. And by therefore removing the link between revenue and sales, it can help to eliminate the disincentives that are in place against investing in things like energy efficiency. Electric decoupling is a very common practice around the country, and we see it as a low-hanging fruit solution to deliver affordability benefits and accelerate efficiency savings. The last two things in terms of rate reviews that we wanted to mention are management audits and CapEx, OpEx equalization. So on the former, management audits can reveal sizable cost savings, whether or not there is an MRP or a PBR structure in place. For example, in 2020, Hawaii underwent a management audit process for its electric utilities, and that revealed around $25 million of annual cost reductions, which translated into immediate bill savings for ratepayers. In terms of CapEx, OpEx equalization, this includes a range of mechanisms that can help to address CapEx bias, which exists under traditional cost of service regulation. This can be another important set of policies for Virginia to consider. For example, OpEx capitalization is a process by which a utility is allowed to amortize a category of OpEx and is allowed to earn a return on it over time. And we've seen this in a couple different states, including Maryland and New Jersey. The United Kingdom has a pretty robust approach to CapEx, OpEx equalization, and we have resources to share if people are interested to learn more about that. So moving on to ROE determinations. In terms of setting ROE, the Commission was previously limited from lowering authorized ROE below the average of a peer group of utilities. It's now our understanding that these restrictions are no longer in place, which should help to remove limitations that in the past may have worked against affordability goals. While peer benchmarking can be useful in terms of providing data points for reference, setting ROE based on peer group average, from our perspective, working in other states does run the risk of reinforcing practices from other jurisdictions that may or may not be relevant as a state moves towards implementation of PBR. In general, it's important to make sure that the regulatory framework in which a utility or a peer utility operates and its corresponding risks are considered when setting ROE. And in states that have implemented PBR mechanisms, what we've seen is that setting ROE has been informed by the PBR mechanisms that are in place. Overall, we've seen that PBR mechanisms can help to insulate a utility from a number of industry risks and uncertainties, lowering their risk profile overall. As a result, states like Illinois and Minnesota have adjusted allowed ROE in part because of their multi-year rate plans, which can provide a known and stable revenue stream over the course of the plan term. In terms of rate adjustment clauses, I know that the stakeholders have discussed this quite a bit in the past, and there are a few things that we wanted to mention in particular. In Virginia today, about half of utility costs are recovered through these trackers. And RACs, the cost trackers, have seen the largest increase in the proportion of customer bills in recent years across trackers, fuel costs, and base rates. What we've seen in other states is that the frequent use of cost trackers erodes cost control incentives. Given the relative speed of recovery that trackers allow for, there can be less of an incentive to pursue cost savings compared to recovery through base rates. By providing essentially guaranteed cost recovery, trackers can lower utilities' financial risks. But what we're seeing is that regulators do not adjust ROEs to account for those changes in risk. In states with multi-year rate plans, we're seeing regulators strictly limiting the use of trackers to avoid diluting the cost containment incentives that the other PBR mechanisms in place create. In terms of fuel costs, Virginia has a 100% fuel cost pass-through, which is generally how things work in most states. However, regulators have begun to look at fuel cost sharing as an alternative approach and an opportunity to deliver cost savings for customers. So instead of a 100% pass-through, utilities share some of the risk of fuel price volatility. While there's little that utilities can do to manage fuel prices, there are numerous ways to manage overall fuel costs. So fuel cost sharing is designed to create an incentive to pursue cost efficiencies as utilities manage fuel costs through things like hedging or investments in energy efficiency and renewables and other zero fuel resources. Fuel cost sharing is becoming an increasingly popular policy, especially in Western states. And we think it could be a key avenue for Virginia to deliver cost savings for ratepayers. I've listed a few states here that have fuel cost sharing in place where customers are currently benefiting, but there's more in addition to this list. So at this point, I'd like to pass it over to Janelle.
Thanks, Oliver. I'll be sharing some of RMI's thoughts and perspectives on the current mechanisms in place in Virginia that relate to performance mechanisms. So in the template, there were 3 primary sections. There's ROE adjustment mechanisms. There was performance incentives associated with case PUR 2023-00210. So I'll cover those as well. And then energy efficiency performance incentive mechanism. So first, I would like to talk about ROE adjustment mechanisms as is set in statute. So agnostic of the process that is happening in case 2023-00210. So the SEC currently has the authority to adjust base ROE by up to plus or minus 50 basis points based on utility performance related to 4 categories: reliability, generating plant performance, customer service, and operating efficiency of a utility. These 4 categories align nicely with several of the HJR 30, SJR 47 performance areas, including reliability and resiliency, cost-efficient utility investment and operations, among others. Our reflection is that the 50 basis point limitation or statutory requirement may be limiting the Commonwealth's ability to incentivize deeper performance improvements with more substantial incentives or earnings opportunities for the utility. Moreover, the statute limits the Commission's authority to adjust base ROE for a wider set of performance areas beyond those four performance categories. So for reflecting on the 13 performance areas included in the HJR 30, SJR 47 resolutions, then the Commission is constrained in terms of rewarding or incentivizing utility performance amongst the broader set of performance areas there. States that have implemented robust portfolios of performance incentive mechanisms or ROE adjustment mechanisms include with performance incentive mechanisms that align with the performance areas of beneficial electrification, DER interconnection and utilization, electricity decarbonization, environmental justice, etc., include Hawaii, New York, Minnesota, Illinois, Colorado, and several others. In many of these states, the PUCs have the authority to determine the priority areas that they will create performance incentives for. And usually these states, what we've seen other states do is commissions engage with stakeholders and utilities to determine which performance areas are most appropriate to create performance incentive mechanisms to improve utility performance on. Recognizing that not all performance areas might require incentivization for a utility to have good performance or maintain good performance. The other thing I'll flag is that it's common for other states to design performance incentive mechanisms in which ROE basis point is the incentive structure. In Hawaii, I'll just cite as an example, the Commission determined that the appropriate aggregate portfolio of ROE adjustment mechanisms or PIMs that would be allowed or acceptable is plus or minus 200 basis points. They took an approach where the Commission was allowed to set that threshold in that jurisdiction. And in most other states, to my knowledge, the Commission has the authority and the discretion to determine how much incentive is appropriate for their utilities. Next slide, please. So now I'd like to think specifically about the financial incentive mechanisms that were established in PUR 2023-0210. And sorry, when I say were established, what I mean is in progress, perhaps. And so I'm thinking about, there are two elements I think that are happening in this proceeding and are ongoing still. One is that there are a set of scorecard metrics or PIMs to align with industry terminology that I'll reflect on first. And then there are a set of separate reporting metrics that will not, that the utilities will provide information against, but are not necessarily going to be incentivized based on their performance on those. Sorry, I've lost the slides. Oliver, are you able to bring those back up?
Sorry about that. Not sure what happened.
No worries. Yeah, and so while you're pulling those up, I'll just issue a caveat here that the evaluation I'm about to articulate is based on my current and best understanding of the status in that proceeding. So recognizing that proceeding is obviously still ongoing, I may be misunderstanding or misinterpreting some of the latest information in that proceeding, but largely I was looking at the Commission staff's August 2024 staff report, the Commission's October 2024 order, and then more recently, the Commission staff's March 2025 draft proposed rules to sort of be the basis for my understanding of how these scorecard metrics or PIMs are going to be implemented in Virginia's context. So with those caveats aside, I'll share what my understanding is of how scorecard metrics are going to be implemented. I think that the way that they're going to be implemented in Virginia, to my understanding, differs from industry best practice in two key ways. Virginia's scorecard metrics do not have prescribed targets, or maybe not all of the scorecard metrics have prescribed targets, or they're referred to as benchmarks, I think, in the proceeding. And then the second is that the incentive that is potentially to be earned by the utility for its performance will be determined in a non-formulaic manner at the time when the utility submits their performance data against the scorecard metrics. So as I understand it, the benchmarks for scorecard metrics will be set retrospectively in some cases, maybe not all, and will be informed by what the utility proposes when they file their Schedule 49 filing requirements, based on industry data that they're offering at the time when they're filing their performance against the scorecard metrics. So I think a drawback of this approach is that it might allow for gaming. So for example, what I mean by this is that the utility could selectively submit data from industry that would make its own performance against the 11 scorecard metrics look superior to the rest of the industry to increase the likelihood of it receiving the maximum possible reward of 50 basis points. And the effect of utility gaming is that it could lead to potential negative impact on affordability for ratepayers, particularly if the utility's performance on those 11 scorecard metrics is not actually providing an equal or greater benefit than the monetary value of the incentive, right? In addition to the gaming risk, industry best practice, I would say here, is to establish clear targets for a performance incentive mechanism prior to the period of performance, so that the utility knows the standard by which its performance will be measured against during a forthcoming period of performance. And then it can plan its resources accordingly to try to improve its performance to meet the desired target. I'm not familiar with any other jurisdiction that is implementing performance incentive mechanisms where the target for the performance is unclear in advance of the performance period that the utility's performance will be measured within. So to the second key difference that I noted, the incentive value for each scorecard metric remaining unprescribed until after the period of performance. I believe, my understanding is that this approach in Virginia is based on precedent from a previous iteration of scorecard metrics or standards and protocols prior to 2015. And that the Virginia Commission decided to take a non-formulaic approach, meaning there was no set or prescribed incentive value associated with the utility's performance against a particular metric and target. So industry best practice is to predetermine an incentive amount for achieving a preset target for each metric. The reason this is so valuable is that it gives the utility helpful information in advance of the period of performance to inform how cost-efficient allocation of resources during the performance period can go, so that they make decisions recognizing the resources they have at their disposal to prioritize achieving a certain target in order to earn a knowable or known reward or to avoid a penalty. So if you think about this like more tangibly, a utility who knows the performance target and incentive value for a certain PIM can evaluate the cost of achieving the target relative to the potential earnings of the reward. And it can decide to not attempt to achieve a target if achieving the target will cost more than the earnings that they could get from improving their performance. So this is really helpful, right? If we think about cost-efficient utility investment operations in that performance area, making sure that utilities have an opportunity to earn a larger incentive relative to, or that the earnings incentive, rather, that they have the opportunity to gain is going to be relative to the cost of actually having, they would have to outlay to improve their performance. So I think we can move on to the next slide, please. And I'll talk now about tracking metrics or reporting metrics. So the SEC staff, as I understand, have proposed a set of additional metrics that will be tracked and reported for informational purposes only. And this is consistent with industry best practice of having a portfolio of reporting metrics. The reporting metrics, as I understand it, in this case, were informed by a focus on the same 4 outcomes that informed the process to figure out the scorecard metrics. There are several reporting metrics that SEC staff are proposing to implement that support several of the performance areas, or align with several of the performance areas outlined in HJR 30 and SJR 47, including decarbonization, DER integration, peak demand reduction, etc. That said, the degree to which the reporting metrics the staff have proposed support these broader performance areas, I think, is limited by the narrow focus that was placed on the process as a whole. The formalization of these reporting metrics, I think, is a really important and positive step forward in terms of tracking and measuring data related to a broad set of critical performance areas for utilities in Virginia. And reported metrics can be particularly helpful for establishing utility performance baselines for newer or evolving metrics, and can be useful in the future, particularly when you think about setting a target or setting a benchmark when evaluating a metric from something that hasn't been reported before, when you are thinking about designing new performance incentive mechanisms. So it's common to have more than one reporting metric per performance area or performance outcome, because typically there's no single metric on its own that can provide a holistic understanding of how a utility is performing against a certain outcome or performance area. And so having multiple tracking metrics supports refinement and iteration over time to know like which metrics are best measuring utilities' performance and improvement for a performance area. So here, just reiterating that this is oftentimes a journey, and taking an iterative approach can be really helpful. So you can expand, retire, or refine reporting metrics over time. So there's also an opportunity, I think, to establish reporting requirements that are more dynamic and accessible than reporting just within utility rate case dockets. Some metrics might require or benefit from more frequent reporting time frames, such as like a quarterly update. And then sometimes it might be that like more granular levels of data, such as analyzing performance at the census tract level, can unveil really helpful insights. So I would point folks to thinking about industry best practice of making utility performance data accessible and easily interpretable to the general public through the use of a data dashboard. And so there's several utilities that have and commissions that have established performance dashboards where all metrics, scorecards, and PIMs can be seen. I know in Alberta, Canada, they've done this, also in Hawaii. And so would point folks towards those examples. So with that, I think we're done and we can open it up to questions.
Any questions for Janelle and Oliver, or even just perspectives on what you've heard?
Yeah, Larry, this is Glenn. Thank you so much for the overview. I appreciate it, and a couple of good points in there, especially about the scorecards. You can't do kind of retroactive incentives. That defeats the purpose of kind of giving an incentive to incent entities to do things. So completely understand that. I know a number of states were cited, and there's a couple of states that are competitive with Virginia that have rates that are less than Virginia, and also do, and one of them actually, I guess, has performance-based rate making, which is North Carolina. Not to have to go through it now, but is there a way to do kind of a review of what North Carolina does in their performance-based rate making? I believe they do the decoupling you mentioned, but I'm kind of curious what else they do, as we like to learn from states that we're competing against that right now we're a little behind the 8 ball on. And I'm not, we're not too concerned about, New York or New Jersey or Maryland. Thankfully, we're getting business from those states coming to Virginia. But there are some states that we're concerned, and I'd be kind of curious what like North Carolina does in their performance-based rate making.
Yeah, thank you for that question, Glenn. My colleague Kara Goldenberg and I came to this group back in January, in which we provided a presentation covering performance-based regulation models that have been implemented in other jurisdictions. This was a very case study focused presentation. And so if you go back to that presentation and recording, we did a specific and dedicated focus on North Carolina, recognizing that North Carolina has taken a rather comprehensive approach to implementing PBR. And so I think you'll find that presentation and those slides are helpful.
I appreciate it. Thank you, Larry. If you and I can maybe catch up with that later this week.
Thanks, Janelle. And always a good reminder that our webpage on this is a treasure trove of information at this point, after all of the presentations and other input we've had. So I see Robert next, then Rachel, and then I'll get to your question in the text, Matt. So Robert, you're up next.
Hey, this is Rob Locke with Dominion Energy. Thank you for taking my question, and very nice presentation. Just want to add a little thoughts and perspective. When you look at price in individual states for electricity, there are massive differences, between the highs and lows. And, I just pulled up a report. There was a report, the American Legislative Exchange Council, just in February of this year, published their energy affordability report. And they ranked each state essentially for energy affordable, and truly it's a electricity price report. And it's something, we can all take a look at it. It's out there, it's very public. When you go down and I was looking at each of the categories that, we went through here in this report, you pick off Hawaii as one of the states. Hawaii ranked 50th in price. You put California in there, they ranked 49th. Put Massachusetts, they ranked 48th. New York, 43rd. Vermont, 41st. Minnesota, 36th. Illinois, 33rd. So, and I think Colorado was 30th. So it appears that very expensive electric price states put a lot of these measures into their overall, portfolio with the regulators. Any thoughts on, how that applies to us here?
Yeah, great question, Robert. Oliver, I saw you come off mute as well. So maybe we'll both have thoughts to offer here. One of my reflections, Robert, is that often the reason why states decide, commissions in particular, when they are in the leading role of adopting performance-based regulation or designing performance-based regulation that could be adopted in the future, they are often doing so because they are at a point where they recognize that the regulatory framework in which the utilities operate needs some tweaking in order to better support cost control and affordability. Sorry, I'm hearing an echo of myself. So I'm going to stop talking and see if Oliver, if you want to jump in.
Yeah, I think it's an important point, and I think it'd be worth considering kind of the history of those prices experienced in those states relative to kind of to the timeline of any PBR mechanisms that have put in place. I know in New England, for example, a lot of the PBR mechanisms that have been pursued were explicitly in response to existing high prices that were there already. You can think of the degree to which the New England region is constrained in terms of gas supply, which is one of the primary drivers of electric price increases. And that's something that's top of mind for regulators as they consider PBR mechanisms among a portfolio of potential solutions to try to reduce prices as much as possible and or reduce the rate of growth as much as they can. But certainly a point well taken. Maybe I'll pass it back to Janelle if you have more thoughts there.
Yeah, thank you. I think that you covered it really nicely. The build I would offer is that performance-based regulation shouldn't be thought of as a silver bullet solution to contain cost, right? I think the right way to think about it is making some refinements to the regulatory framework and the incentives that utilities have so that they are better aligned with supporting cost control or cost containment or affordability. Robert, you brought up electricity rates and prices. And so I think these aren't solutions to that challenge, but they can help align the utilities' incentives with supporting affordability. Of course, there are going to be other factors going on always that need to be looked at heavily. And then the last thing I'll say is that performance-based regulation, like it's not easy to evaluate whether performance-based regulation has successfully supported reduction in costs for ratepayers or successfully supported affordability for ratepayers. And that's for a few reasons. One is that as you might remember from January, implementation of performance-based regulation looks highly different in every single jurisdiction. And second, to Oliver's point, there are different factors in every single jurisdiction that are influencing why costs are increasing or what's going on in the state. And then finally, I'll just say that though it's not easy to figure out like, well, is performance-based regulation successfully supporting a reduction in electricity rates, like electricity bills for customers? What I can point you to, Robert, is that in Hawaii, they're currently going through an evaluation of the performance-based regulatory framework since it's been in place now for 4 years. And they're in the 5th and final year of the first multi-year rate plan. And so they're evaluating cost trends during that time. And they're finding, I think we presented on this in January, they were finding evidence in Hawaii to suggest that the multi-year rate plan was successful at curbing some categories of utility spending and encouraging some cost efficiency.
Thank you. And then Rachel.
Thanks, Larry, and thank you, Janelle and Oliver. Janelle, I appreciate you mentioning the earlier presentation you had given because one of my questions stems from that presentation. where, and if my memory fails me, like, please correct me, but I think one of the key components you discussed then was establishing goals, and I want to say like goals and objectives. And I was thinking about the presentation pieces that you provided here, and my observation is that Virginia has like a policy framework, and there are different laws and policies that inform and influence how the commission is regulating the utility. But in terms of goals and objectives, those don't seem as clearly articulated to really understand sort of if and how the current mechanisms support those. And I'm curious if in your research, if you had a similar assessment or if you have some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I can respond to this first, Rachel, and then Oliver, if you have thoughts, feel free to jump in. I was actually, I think I tried to make a reference to this same point, Rachel, when I was talking about like the juxtaposition of the four performance areas that are set in statute that are the limiting factors or the guiding factors rather for what performance areas can be incentivized. And so those were the generator plant performance, utility, cost efficient operations, reliability, and I'm forgetting the fourth now. But that is like in stark contrast to the set of 13 performance areas that were outlined in the resolutions that were informing this study process. And so, yeah, when we look at other jurisdictions that have embarked upon any sort of performance-based regulatory journey, oftentimes you will find that those states have conducted first a process to determine, okay, what are the problems that we're hoping to address? What are the goals that we have for the future of the electricity system in our state? And that might vary depending on the that will vary significantly depending on the jurisdiction and the market structure and the types of utilities and how many utilities are operating in each jurisdiction. And so, yeah, definitely other jurisdictions sort of start like from a square one basis of, okay, what do we want to, what are our goals? And then what are the outcomes we want to measure our progress towards those goals against? And then of those things that we want to measure ourselves against, where is the utility performing well already? i.e. that might not need an incentive, but we might just want to like track it and monitor it over time, or track to monitor to make sure performance doesn't decrease or decline. And then where is the utility maybe performing less well currently that we want to actually create an incentive for them to improve their performance or change some of their behaviors and decision making. And that should be a consideration that's made with the whole regulatory framework in mind, reflecting on where the utility might lack an incentive to do that already, or where they may have an incentive to do something else that works in contrast to those goals and objectives. Does that answer your question, Rachel?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Oliver, did you have anything else you would add?
No, nothing to add from me.
Thanks. I know we have a question in the chat from Matt Allenbauer with Appalachian Voices regarding fuel cost sharing. In the states where it has been implemented, could you give examples of the percentage of fuel costs that are borne by the utility as opposed to being passed through to the customer? Or could you give what a best practice percentage of fuel cost sharing would be?
Sure. I think I can look back to see what common practice is. I think 5% covered by the utility is kind of a common approach. And how that works is that it's the difference between expected costs and actual costs. And that difference, rather than 100% being passed through, you would pass through only 95%, and that 5% remaining would be covered by the utility. But it varies, and there's different ways to structure it, but that kind of percentage is on the order of what is generally considered a reasonable starting point, and can be enough to motivate pretty substantial cost savings and behavior changes, even though on the face of it, it may seem like a pretty small percentage.
Thank you. Any other questions or just perspectives to share on what Janelle and Oliver have presented here? Rachel?
Thanks. I don't know that this is necessarily your area of expertise, but just observing some of the back and forth in the chat, I'm curious if you could speak to, like, there's conversation about price, electricity prices, and then like overall bills. And I think understanding, so I appreciate your point that PBR is not necessarily like a fix to price and or bill concerns, but I'm curious, when you mentioned Hawaii's evaluation and sort of the downward trend, was that a downward trend in relationship to prices and therefore bills, or sort of bills overall? Like how should we think about, yeah, I mean, essentially what customers are paying. Like the overall bill is comprised of a variety of things. And so how do we think about impacts from a PBR framework?
Yeah, Rachel, in Hawaii, I can point you to the analysis done by the stakeholder involved in that proceeding that suggested that there had been some cost efficiencies, but they were not looking at the ratepayer bill or the rate impact of those costs. They were looking primarily at utility spending during that period of time and how those trends had shifted relative to the utility spending prior to the multi-year rate plan and the whole comprehensive PBR framework going into effect at the same time and being in effect at the same time. And it's still rather early days, right? 4 years is not that long to have been implementing this new framework. And in the course of that 4-year time frame, a global pandemic happened. There have been global supply chain shortages. There have been fuel price spikes, right? So it's there's always going to be like, and then also there was, not to mention, a major wildfire that occurred on one of the islands in Hawaii, and so that has damaged the utilities' credit rating and their ability to get low cost debt. Or equity, sorry. So anyway, I think I can share with you offline the analysis that was done that sort of found like what the dynamics have been in Hawaii since the framework has gone into place. But I can't speak to that right now off the top of my head, the details. Oliver, do you have anything to add in response to Rachel's question?
Is it fair to say then, I just want to make sure I'm following your response, that like understanding utility spending versus electricity price versus customer bill, those aren't all sort of like, if you just throw all those numbers out there, they aren't necessarily immediately comparable, like truly understanding cost drivers and sort of what that means for what customers are paying. That's a more detailed analysis. Is that a fair assessment? What?
Yeah, we definitely didn't do that in our evaluation of the current regulatory framework mechanisms in Virginia that resemble performance-based regulation, or are maybe called or thought of as performance-based regulation by some. I think what Oliver was presenting on earlier, however, right, when you think about fuel cost risk sharing, when you think about the use of rate adjustment clauses, RACs, I think is the term in Virginia, or cost trackers, those can, like, there are a myriad of other elements that are going to exist in every regulatory framework that are going to have an impact on either the incentives that the utility has to contain or control or reduce costs, or the lack thereof, right? So what Oliver did in his portion of the presentation, I think, is touch on the mechanisms that might be working in contrast to affordability for ratepayers, and maybe like not definitely not working in support of, or the absence of mechanisms that can better support affordability for ratepayers.
Gotcha. That's the other thing that was in the back of my head was the RAC. So thank you.
Thanks, Janelle. And if you could send that link to the Hawaii evaluation to Jonica, I think a lot of people would be interested to see that, so we can put that up on the website. Are there any other questions for Janelle and Oliver? John.
Hi, my name is John Lord. I'm with the Virginia Energy Purchasing Governmental Association. I'm curious if, let's suppose the commission decided to do a extended multi-year rate plan and to try to pull the rate adjustment clauses back. Has there been any documented transition case where they've been able to take something like what we have now and get back to that, where are there stumbling blocks? Are there things that we know we should avoid? Are there cases where you want to do it a particular way or not want to do it a particular way?
Yeah, I think we can think a little bit more about that and send you some more information. I think what we are trying to flag in the presentation was just the risk of over-reliance on those kinds of trackers. And I think you can see examples in different states of kind of movement back and forth in terms of how costs are recovered through which mechanism. But there are certainly pitfalls to avoid and things to look out for when you're identifying what trackers are appropriate, whether or not they apply to things that are in or outside of utility control, among other issues. So yeah, maybe that could be something we flag for ourselves to share more information on.
Thank you.
Katja.
Yeah, hi Janelle and Oliver and Kara. This is really helpful presentation, so thank you. I'm not sure if you all are familiar with some of the conversations that have been happening in Virginia around reliability and affordability concerns as a result of forecast demand increases, especially around a lot of the data center conversations. And so I wondered if you had any thoughts about PBR tools that could maybe help curb some of those concerns, or just ways that we should be braiding these two conversations together, and if you see any room for potential in PBR to maybe promote performance while also addressing some of the challenges that we might be experiencing on that side in the future and now, really.
Yeah, one thing, Kaja, that could be considered, right, is the use of performance incentive mechanisms. And so if at the end of this process, the commission determines it's appropriate to recommend, right, expanding the use of performance incentive mechanisms, or thinking about their application to different topics beyond the 4 that are listed in the statute currently, there could be an opportunity to establish mechanisms that incentivize utilities to invest in and deliver benefits to ratepayers more from demand side management, from non-wires alternatives, right, from leveraging opportunities to deploy new generation more quickly behind existing surplus interconnection locations, right, where there's an existing point of interconnection. It doesn't require like an expansion or significant expansion of the transmission capacity or network, and that you can deploy more resources or locate a data center in certain places, right? So I think there's lots of creative opportunities. And just generally, right, if you think about a comprehensive performance-based regulatory framework, creating incentives for utilities to better leverage the distributed energy resources and assets that already exist and that they already operate or own to deliver the most benefits. That's just going to be like helpful. It's probably not going to be sufficient alone to address like the projected demand from data center load. But it can be helpful in curbing the extent to which that just like skyrockets, right? The investments that are necessary.
That's really
And
helpful.
one thing I'll add too, in terms of making sure that any resources that are being used to meet that load growth are cost effective. I think PBR offers a way to get more specific and effective in terms of measuring and tracking affordability outcomes. For instance, energy burden, the percentage of household income used for energy expenditures, is an increasingly important way to track affordability outcomes. And I'm not fully up to speed about what kind of low-income discount rates, for example, exist in Virginia, but I think you can design metrics and incentives to make sure that everyone who is eligible for those rates are currently enrolled, among other things, to pair kind of the resource question with the affordability question as you're dealing with these unique load growth challenges.
Okay. Thank you. And thank you, Janelle. I know you have to go to another meeting, but I don't see any more questions in the chat and no more raised hands. So I think we'll conclude here. But thank you for the presentation and discussion. And thank you, Oliver.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so with that, we will move to the next part of our agenda for today, where Clean Virginia and Synapse Energy will present a potential PBR concept for Virginia focused on multi-year rate plans. So we have Laura Gonzalez-Guerrero from Clean Virginia and Melissa Wooded from Synapse Energy. And so I'll hand it over to Laura and Melissa.
Great. Thank you for having me. Look forward to the discussion today. And I think that our presentation will dovetail nicely with RMI's presentation, especially with Oliver's section. So I'll just share my screen. Again, my name is Melissa Whited. I'm a vice president at Synapse Energy Economics. We're a small consulting firm located in the Boston area. So today I want to talk briefly, because a lot of this has already been covered, about the current regulatory framework and the incentives in that framework, followed by MRP risks and potential benefits, and the various incentives that are provided by the different MRP components. And then I want to come up and discuss the Virginia-specific regulatory framework and how we might fit an MRP onto that framework in order to provide customer benefits and achieve our energy policy goals. And of course, it's always nice to talk about MRPs in theory, but we want to make sure that they're actually working and delivering the benefits that we hope for. So I'm going to conclude with some evaluation criteria that you can use when you're looking back to adjust the MRP and make it work better and see where it's working well. So this table compares traditional cost of service regulation in the left column to Virginia's version, Virginia's modified cost of service regulation framework. And just quickly to compare across the different components of the framework, under traditional cost of service regulation, you have rate cases as needed. While in Virginia, we know that we have a 2-year framework, or 2-year cadence, 2 rate cases. In both traditional cost of service regulation and under Virginia's regulatory framework, you don't have any base rate adjustments between rate cases. And in Virginia, we have an earnings test where over-earnings are largely shared with customers, especially above a certain threshold, while you typically don't see that under traditional cost of service regulation. And then probably where we have the most difference is that trackers tend to be used quite sparingly under traditional cost of service regulation, while in Virginia we have widespread use of trackers, or the RACs. So what are the different incentives under these two frameworks? Well, I think the utilities profit incentives remains pretty much the same under both of those frameworks. There's the throughput incentive to increase sales and generate more revenue. And that can also result in opposition to load reducing measures like energy efficiency or distributed generation. And there tends to be an incentive to increase rate base, at least if the allowed ROE is above the actual cost of capital. Under traditional cost of service regulation, there tends to be some limited cost containment incentives because of regulatory lag, which is the time between when a utility puts something in service, puts an investment in service, and when they actually are able to begin recovering those costs, which tends to be at the next rate case. So that time duration provides the incentive to reduce costs a bit, keep costs under control, because rate cases are expensive and they take a lot of time. So the utility typically doesn't want to file a rate case every year unless they really have to. But in Virginia, because we have such widespread use of RACs, much of the costs that the utility faces are actually reconciled each year. And so there's very limited regulatory lag. And even the regulatory lag that we have with the timing between rate cases, it's only every 2 years. And if we're relying on cost forecasts, then that reduces regulatory lag even more. And what that means is that there's limited cost control incentive, right? If the utility spends some money for something that's recovered through a tracker, it gets to recover those costs very quickly. Even if the cost is going into base rates, the recovery period is very short as well. And RACs, or trackers in general, are widely acknowledged to shift the risks from shareholders to customers because the utility is able to recover those costs so quickly that there's no negative impact on its bottom line, and without the expense and delay that accompanies a rate case filing. So this quote is from S&P Global. It's something that's been widely acknowledged, and yet we have about 50% of costs currently recovered through RACs in Virginia. And I know that with Dominion's forecasted investments, much of those could potentially be recovered through RACs. So if we think about how to rebalance the risk across utilities and ratepayers, then we might think about how to bring those RACs into base rates. This would not only rebalance the risk, but also provide more incentives for cost containment. And one way to do that is through an MRP framework. So there's the question of whether an MRP is actually going to provide better incentives. And it's important to note that an MRP does not always provide better incentives because it really depends on how it's designed. A well-designed MRP will provide customer benefits by encouraging cost efficiency and by creating more predictable rates for customers. On the utility side, it can also provide more predictable revenues for the utility and more timely recovery of costs relative to traditional cost of service regulation. But a poorly designed MRP only allows utilities to recover costs more quickly without providing cost containment incentives, without increasing those benefits to ratepayers. So it does this by reducing regulatory lag, but not having the cost control incentives, and can potentially shift risk to ratepayers if the commission pre-approves certain investments. It can also exploit information asymmetries by relying on utility cost forecasts, as opposed to relying on external indices of cost escalation. And I just want to provide a quick example of a cautionary tale here from Maryland. Maryland's MRP actually it works more like a broad-based cost tracker than a true MRP. Under a true MRP, you typically have a revenue cap, and the utility has to live within that cap. That revenue cap can be determined in different ways, either through cost forecasts or through an external index where you escalate revenues each year according to that index. But either way, the utility has to live within that cap. If its costs exceed that cap, then it eats at least a large portion of those costs. If it achieves cost savings, then it generally gets to keep a large portion of those costs, and that's what provides the cost containment incentive. But in Maryland, we have the annual revenue requirements set based on cost forecasts and a reconciliation process, which trues up the utility's revenues to equal actual costs in most cases. The utility doesn't get to recover the carrying costs if it overspends its cost forecast, but otherwise it's generally made whole. So the result has been significant rate increases. We've seen annual average rate increases of 6% each year. And in some cases, the utilities have exceeded their forecast budgets by more than 43%. So why? Again, it's because of the reconciliation mechanism. It erodes the utilities' cost containment incentive because the utilities recover any excess spending and they don't benefit from achieving any cost savings. They don't get to keep any cost savings. They have to return that to customers. So when we think about the incentives in MRPs, we need to think about several different design elements. And I want to stress that it's important to consider how these elements work together. You need to really consider them holistically, because if you only consider them in isolation, you may not realize that there's another element that's undermining some of the incentives provided by a different element. So the first is what goes into the revenue requirement. And in some cases, MRPs are designed where only the O&M costs are covered under the revenue requirement of the MRP, and capital costs or other costs are treated differently. But the more costs that you have included in the MRP and within that revenue cap, the greater the cost containment incentive. If you have other costs that are recovered through RACs or something else, then that erodes the cost containment incentive. The second component is the attrition relief mechanism, which is how revenues are escalated each year. And external cost indices typically provide stronger cost containment incentives than utility cost forecasts. Third is the reconciliation to actual costs. And there, again, we have, this should not be a part of an MRP. It is in some cases, but generally it's not best practice to include it in an MRP because it erodes the utility's cost containment incentives. Fourth is the earnings sharing mechanism. And there, this can be very helpful to customers because it ensures that the utility does not excessively over-earn, maybe because the cost forecast was wrong or the index that we're escalating revenues by is very wrong. So excess over-earnings are delivered back to customers under an earnings sharing mechanism. But we need to be careful because by doing that, you're also reducing the benefit to the utility of finding cost efficiencies. And so that can erode the utility's cost containment incentive. And then finally, the rate case stay-out period. Typically, we have 3 to 5 year stay-out periods, but the longer the stay-out period, the more then the utility has an incentive to find cost efficiencies that may take several years to implement and to start to reap the benefits of. But the longer stay-out period encourages them to implement those because they're able to benefit more from those cost savings before the next rate case comes and they have to reset their revenues to their actual costs. So quickly, again, if you include more of the revenue requirement, more of the utilities costs in the MRP revenue requirement, then the utility will have a stronger cost containment incentive. And that means that trackers and riders should be used very sparingly for extraordinary costs, for those costs that the utility has no control over. So this may be specific, unusual, large investments that you otherwise wouldn't have predicted. Or you might have recurring pass-through costs or mandated costs, or one-time extraordinary costs. So can revenue adjustment clauses in Virginia be incorporated into an MRP? And I submit that they can. We could include, for example, the generation costs in the MRP, and there are different options on how to adjust those costs over the period of the MRP. The first option is to use the utilities cost forecast for what those costs will be over the next 3 to 5 years. There are a number of examples here: Florida Power and Light, Duke Progress, North Carolina, PG&E for capital. And the benefits of this is that you can accommodate forecasted large changes in the utilities costs. Of course, the risk is that the utility inflates its cost forecasts, and due to information asymmetry, it can be very difficult to tease that out, whether the cost forecast is really reasonable or not. So the other option is the external index. This is used a lot in Canada, especially with Ontario's power generation, and it's used for O&M expenses in a lot of places like PG&E. And this is nice because it doesn't rely on the individual utilities cost forecast. So if that's inflated, then it doesn't matter because you're using an external index. And it doesn't require that cost or specific investments are pre-approved or even reviewed before the MRP begins. The risk here, of course, is that the index may not provide sufficient revenues and the index may not be accurate. Costs are probably set to increase quite significantly due to, say, tariffs that we may have not anticipated. So the third element, earnings sharing mechanisms, this is, of course, in place in Virginia right now. And because so many of current costs are recovered through RACs, there's little reason to allow the utilities to retain over earnings because much of the revenues are just trued up to actual costs as it is, and that creates very little risk for the utilities. If under an MRP there is the ability of the utility to find cost efficiencies, then we can think about allowing the utility to retain much higher shares of any excess earnings above its allowed ROE. Of course, this does present a risk that if the utility is over-earning due to something else outside of its control, such as increases in load, that customers are not benefiting from that if the utility is retaining all of those over-earnings. And so you may want to have some sharing with customers. Again, as Oliver mentioned, this is a balancing act. You want the utility to have the incentive to reduce costs, and you don't want to shift all the risks to customers from indices or cost forecasts being wrong. And again, if many or most costs are still recovered through the RACs in an MRP, then we want over earnings to be largely returned to customers because the utility is facing very little risk due to all those costs being recovered through RACs. I'll just quickly mention again, reconciliation. This removes the utility's incentive to find cost efficiencies and should be avoided. That's true for annual reconciliations or reconciliations at the end of the MRP term. And the rate case stay-out period, this can also impact cost control incentives, again, because a longer stay-out period lets the utility invest in cost containment measures at the beginning of the period and enjoy the savings from those cost containment measures, cost efficiencies, for longer until the next rate case. And so it provides stronger incentives for the utility to reduce its cost and find those cost efficiencies. Of course, a shorter stay-out period can reduce the risk to both the utilities and to customers that we got the cost forecast wrong or the cost index wrong. And if most utility costs are included in the MRP's revenue requirement, then you may want to consider the longer stay-out period so that the utility has these incentives to find cost efficiencies. Typically, we're seeing 3 to 5 years. And if that is not enough of an incentive to find cost efficiencies, you could use something like an efficiency carryover mechanism. And that's where we see, maybe we compare the forecasted costs in a certain area, like O&M, to what the utility actually achieved. And if the utility was able to significantly reduce its costs in O&M, then perhaps you allow it to retain a portion of those cost savings into the next rate period, even after you reset rates. So that can help improve the utility's cost containment incentives, even when you have a shorter period between rate cases. If you have many or most of your costs were covered through RACs still, then you may want to use a shorter period between rate cases in an MRP, because you want to make sure that the utility is not over earning due to the RACs. Decoupling, this was also mentioned in Oliver's presentation, but it's not required as part of an MRP, but it can certainly help by removing the disincentive, or at least reducing the disincentive for utilities to promote energy efficiency and distributed generation, because you're delinking sales and revenues. So under a decoupling mechanism, the utility's actual revenues are trued up to its allowed revenue requirement. That doesn't mean that its actual revenues are trued up to its actual costs, but just to the allowed revenue requirement. And if by doing that, you're reducing this disincentive to invest in energy efficiency and distribute generation, then the utility may be more likely to go out and find ways to reduce costs through using those types of investments, those types of resources. And if you do go forward with decoupling, you should consider strengthening the energy efficiency targets, because you're reducing the risk to the utility of earnings erosion from energy efficiency and distributed generation. So the utility is more likely to go out and be able to do more of that. And so therefore, you can have higher energy efficiency targets. And I want to conclude this section by just restating what we see as the most important elements of the MRP. The first one is ensuring that the majority of costs are included in the MRP mechanism, and that any escalation of the revenue requirement between the rate cases does not directly track costs. Again, avoid reconciliations, because otherwise you remove the utility's incentive to reduce costs. Second one is the stay out period. You want it long enough to encourage cost reductions while balancing risks to customers. And 3 to 5 years tends to be what jurisdictions go with there. But if you continue to use RACs broadly, then maybe you want to go with a shorter stay out period. And either way, you can still use efficiency carryover mechanisms to encourage the utility to reduce costs. And finally, earnings sharing mechanisms balance the impact on utility cost containment incentives with mitigating risk to customers. And finally, once you have an MRP framework in place, it's important to evaluate it. Is it achieving its goals? So for example, in terms of information and resource asymmetry, we want to make sure that the allowed revenues are being set in an objective manner. If they are based on the utility's own cost estimates, then we need to be extra careful about information asymmetry. And typically, we require more information if we're using utility cost forecasts. For example, a comprehensive capital plan for distribution capital, as well as resource planning, that helps provide some certainty to regulators and to other stakeholders that the costs included in the forecast are reasonable. And is the utility looking for and proposing alternatives that are lower cost to traditional capital investments? And here we're thinking about non-wires alternatives or power purchase agreements, as opposed to simply building more infrastructure. In terms of risk, consider if the risk is being managed and who bears the different risks. The utility management is most able to reduce its risks by managing its operations. Ratepayers aren't managing the utilities, so ratepayers should not be bearing the majority of risks. So we want the risk of management to remain with utility management. Who bears the risk of cost overruns? Who bears the risk of forecast errors? And who bears the risk of stranded costs? Again, ratepayers don't have insight into a lot of these aspects of the utility business. Regulators are not the ones managing the utility business, so those risks should remain with utility management. In terms of core services, is the utility excessively cutting costs in core services, and are we seeing impacts in terms of reliability or customer service? Policy goals, are we achieving the energy policy goals of the Commonwealth beyond what we would typically see under business as usual? And finally, administrative burden. This is something that's often touted as a benefit of MRPs, but in our experience, it is often the case that MRPs don't result in meaningful improvements in administrative burden. So we want to design the MRP with an eye to also reducing administrative burden and make sure that that's actually happening. And I think I'll stop there. I'm happy to take questions and discuss any of this more.
Thank you, Melissa. Appreciate that. And I'm going to suggest we divide our discussion here into 3 parts. First, some clarifying questions for Melissa. Then we can maybe move on to some discussion from those who agree that a multi-year rate plan would or could be an improvement in the current structure. And then lastly, maybe hear from those who disagree, think that a multi-year rate plan would not be an improvement on the structure we have now. So just to kick off, are there any clarifying questions from what you've heard in Melissa's presentation? Okay, everybody seems to have taken it in. All right, so then for the second part of the discussion, I would just like to hear from people who maybe generally agree that, again, multi-year rate plans could or would be a better structure for Virginia. Maybe explain any benefits you see, and if you have any specific implementation ideas. Melissa presented us with a kind of range of things that can happen under the MRP framework, but if anyone sees anything they really think would be particularly beneficial in Virginia, it'd be interesting to hear that perspective as well. So just, to start off, anyone who, and I see Victoria, thanks.
Sure. Yeah, I just want to call attention to the part of her presentation where she was talking about implementation of multi-year rate plans in the context of the extent to which riders are populating residential customers' bills or any customer's bills. So in thinking about implementing it in Virginia, we'd also have to take a look at riders.
Thanks, Victoria. Any other perspectives on the multi-year rate plan, the benefits you see or how it could be implemented? Rachel?
Hey, Larry. I don't remember the specifics of what Janelle shared, but I'm just remembering, I feel like her conversation highlighted opportunities for overlap and also other mechanisms in conjunction with the multi-year rate plan. And I think understanding sort of those overlaps, and I know I mentioned it earlier, just understanding goals and objectives and sort of which combination of which components might best achieve a stated outcome is just something that's in my mind following both of those presentations.
Thanks. And Melissa, would you have any perspective on, I guess the interactions between multi-year rate plans and some of the other PBR elements?
Sure. So the main other PBR elements that I'm thinking of are, of course, PIMs. So, we have some of the basic elements in place if you're already tracking reliability and ensuring that there's not excessive cost cutting there. But as Janelle was discussing, many other jurisdictions have set different types of PIMs for different types of goals. And you do want to make sure that you're setting the ROE mindful of the earnings that are possible through the PIMs, and that we're thinking about how the cost of achieving the PIM is going to be recovered. Are we building that into the MRP revenue requirement? If so, are there cost containment incentives there? Because otherwise, the utility has a strong incentive to go out and achieve the PIM at virtually any cost if you aren't coupling it with strong cost containment incentives.
Thank you. And Joe, I see your hand up next.
Yeah, thank you. It's Joe Reed on behalf of Dominion, and thanks for the presentation. I thought it was a good summary of what some of these MYRPs can look like and how they've been implemented in other jurisdictions. Just a couple of general comments on the construct that we have in Virginia now. Which is effectively for base rates, a 2-year multi-year rate plan. I think, I don't want to speak for this commission staff or any other party, but, obviously as you try to project rates and revenue requirements out over a period longer than 2 years, there necessarily can be less certainty around that. And whether our regulators and other stakeholders would be, comfortable with a construct where you're trying to predict rates and revenue requirements out 3, 4, 5 years is something that would have to be considered if there's going to be any change to the current construct. I think it's also fair to say that most of these jurisdictions that have moved to longer multi-year rate plan structures are moving from traditional cost of service regulatory models that don't have features that we currently have in Virginia, including earnings sharing, right? They're not necessarily moving from a structure where essentially every dollar that gets spent by the utility, whether that's through base rates, through rate adjustment clauses, or through the fuel factor, every dollar is reviewed by our commission now for reasonableness and prudence. And they are, there are obviously the opportunities for earnings sharing on base rates where the revenue requirements have deviated from the actual cost of service if the revenues are in excess of the actual cost of service. So, just a couple of factors to keep in mind as we have this debate over: is the current 2-year biennial review process sufficient, or do we need some change?
Thanks, Joe. Any other perspectives on multi-year rate plans and whether they would or would not be an improvement for Virginia or challenges you see? Okay, well, we'll close out this discussion. Thank you very much, Melissa, for the presentation. I really appreciate it. And I will suggest we take a 5-minute break, reconvene at 2:40. Okay, welcome back, everybody. Joe, I see your hand up, but I suspect that's from the last discussion, but just feel free to unmute if you have something to add.
Nope, slow on the draw.
No worries. All right. Well, next we want to move into a discussion on the regulation of competitive service providers, because the resolution, that enabled the SEC study, this stakeholder group, it also mentions that the study should address competitive service providers. Up to now, we've pretty much exclusively focused on the investor-owned utilities. So just first, we want to review the relevant language from the resolution. And then after that, I want to open it up to discussion and give people an opportunity to give their perspectives on how those competitive service providers or CSPs are currently incentivized and how consideration of CSPs should be incorporated into our PBR discussions and the overall SCC study. So this is the language right out of the resolution. So it tees up the study, and then it mentions that such study shall evaluate the potential of such tools and alternative regulatory tools to modernize the legal or regulatory framework relevant to the investor-owned utilities, but also competitive service providers. And it provides this definition of competitive service providers that means entities with generation or transmission and licensed suppliers that sell electricity to end-use customers. So consideration of that definition can be one element of our discussion if anyone has a perspective. I generally tend to think of CSPs with the latter provision as the licensed suppliers that sell electricity to end users, and maybe even more specifically than that, it tends to come up in the context of the retail choice options that exist for certain investor-owned utility customers. So if you go to the next slide, Jonica, there are a few other specific provisions as you go through the many points that the study asks the SEC to cover. These are the ones that directly talk about CSPs. So firstly, it says that the Commission shall provide an analysis of the current regulatory framework and the financial incentives such framework creates for investor-owned electric utilities and competitive service providers in the Commonwealth. It then says that they shall identify possible misalignments between such incentives for investor-owned utilities and competitive service providers and the Commonwealth's energy policy goals. And then following on from that, to analyze performance-based and alternative regulatory tools used in other jurisdictions to correct such misalignments. And then on the next slide, we've got a couple more. So the Commission shall review the varying obligations on investor-owned utilities and competitive service providers. And then finally, analyze the potential impact of competitive service providers to all customers in the Commonwealth. So those are the mentions in the resolution. So if we move on to our discussion of this, and we have a few prompts here, but I'm happy to take whatever input people have. So just the first prompt we have, slightly odd spacing, but if anyone has any input on what influence or incentives does the current regulatory framework provide to CSPs? So we've obviously talked a lot about the incentives that cost of service model and the other elements of Virginia regulation provide the IOUs. Is anyone able to speak to the CSPs and how the system works for them? Yes, Claire.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Claire Gardner, and I am on behalf of NRG Energy, which I believe is the only CSP in the work group. Is that correct?
That's correct. We sent out a few invites, but NRG are the only ones who have joined.
Okay, no problem. So I just want to initiate this by saying that CSPs have a natural market-driven performance-based rate making. Unlike investor-owned utilities, if the customer is dissatisfied with the CSP, the customer can fire the CSP and seek its electric supply elsewhere. So competition drives performance and price adjustments, unlike an investor-owned utility where there's a lack of market pressure for price or service quality optimization. That market pressure exists with the CSPs. On another note, CSPs have licensing requirements in Virginia specifically and reporting requirements. In other states where CSPs are able to market to residential customers, there are enhanced regulations, there are marketing regulations and requirements. So for example, in states like Texas specifically has, it's called, I think, powertochoose.org. It's a website that's run by the commission in Texas, and it ranks CSPs based on customer reviews, price, service, reporting to the commission. So that exists for residential as well. But in terms of performance-based regulatory changes for CSPs, it kind of just exists naturally by the market.
Thanks, Claire. Any other perspectives on the current framework for CSPs? And maybe I'll just open this up to all our prompts. I'll read them out. But if there's any perspective on what effects on CSPs do we expect if PBR type tools were applied, or what would be the challenges in applying PBR alternative tools to CSPs? And then lastly, we have that question of how should the CSP regulation relate to the IOU regulation? And are there certain performance areas, if incentivized, could create more effective dynamics between the IOUs, CSPs, and then the Commonwealth's goals? So if anyone has any perspective in any of those, just please raise your hand or drop it in the chat.
If it's all right, I'll just add to go with the last bullet point question. Obviously, it's better for CSPs to be operating where an investor-owned utility has performance-based rate making, because it kind of levels the playing field in requiring investor-owned utilities to make market-driven business decisions. So I think that's all for me.
Thanks, Claire. We appreciate you carrying the water for the entire CSP community here. Does anyone else have a perspective on CSP regulation, as it stands now, or as it could stand under PBR that they'd like to mention? Or even, again, I mean, one of our goals as a group is passing considerations onto the SCC. Is there anything around the CSPs that we would want the SCC to consider as they complete their study? Okay. Well, thank you. With that, we'll move on to the last part of our agenda for today. So hopefully everyone has been working on their assessment exercise and their final comments. And so today we wanted to give an opportunity for a kind of a Q&A session on PBR tools. So Great Plains Institute and Current Energy Group, they're working with the SCC on the study. And they're available to answer questions about PBR and alternative rate making tools to aid the participants in completing their final assessments. That they'll draw upon their work and experience on these topics in other states to clarify the options or respond to questions that participants may be grappling with. So if you've been trying to formulate your thoughts on PBR and you've had a question, this is a great time to ask it. The one caveat to this discussion, as Great Plains and Current Energy are working with the SCC to conduct this overarching study, they will not be able to provide any opinions specific to Virginia. So nothing on the current framework in Virginia or alternative frameworks in Virginia. Technical, mechanical questions, yes, but they just won't be able to provide any opinion pieces. So with that, we have Eileen Cole from Great Plains, we have Dan Crosscall and Matt McDonald from Current Energy Group. So again, this is very broad, just as we're concluding, if you have any outstanding questions, especially those that would help you with your comments, now's a great time to raise your hand and ask. So please do.
Thanks, Larry. And I was going to say, I think it might be my colleague Matt McDonald from Current Energy Group and myself primarily, although Eileen and if others from GPI are on, certainly welcome their participation here. I believe the idea is, and we can introduce ourselves in a moment just to give a little bit of context, but the idea is we can speak from our experience and research on performance-based regulation just to fill in any gaps. But I will say at the outset that there's been quite a complete and at least broad discussion today and over the course of these workshops. So what you've heard from other presenters probably covers many of those questions, but we're very happy just to elaborate or give a little additional perspective as people may be thinking about the questions that have come up over time. With that, I'll for myself, you've seen me a couple times before, but Dan Cross-Call, I'm with Current Energy Group, joined just 2 months ago, but previously I've worked in a couple different states on PBR and other investigations. That includes work as an advisor to the Hawaii PUC on their PBR development. And I should say this was when I was at RMI myself, but I was an advisor to the Hawaii PUC as well as PBR processes undertaken in Nevada and North Carolina, and have participated in other facets elsewhere. So that's the experience that I bring. Matt, are you on and you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Matt McDonald, managing partner at Current Energy Group, and focus a lot of my efforts on regulatory innovation and taking a look at regulatory frameworks, including performance-based regulation. Just in terms of a little bit of my background, I spent about a half decade as commission counsel at the Hawaii Public Utilities Commission, which included serving as staff lead on helping to inform and formulate Hawaii's PBR framework through phase 1, and had an opportunity to collaborate with Dan in that capacity. Since departing the commission, I've supported commissions across other states in similar capacities. Most recently, been working with Connecticut's PURA as they look to implement and develop a PBR framework there as well. Have also done a number of different research, including developing an alternative regulatory mechanism report and white paper for EEI in a past role while at Navigant, now Guidehouse. So happy to speak, as Dan mentioned, to just the tools themselves and how they may send different signals and how they may interface and interact with one another if there's questions on a general matter there. So I'll leave it there.
And I'm Eileen Cole with the Great Plains Institute. I've done some performance-based regulation work in Washington. I also do a lot of just general utility innovation regulatory work, electric and gas sectors in many states, coast to coast. So happy to be here.
Rachel, you're first.
Thanks, Larry. And thanks, Matt, Dan, and Eileen. I feel like we have had a variety of presenters share input about components of PBR and sort of the various mechanisms. And I feel like there has been a consistent recognition that like a robust framework involves a variety of these components working hopefully in concert. And I asked earlier, so I don't mean to be a broken record, but just about the importance of goals and objectives, sort of to understand like what is this new framework aiming to achieve? And so my question is, I'm curious if you have thoughts or suggestions on how that like goal setting, objective identifying process can be implemented well, such that whatever follow-on collection of tools hopefully can you can assess where you're going.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Rachel. I can start and just reflect on some of the experiences we've seen from other jurisdictions. Certainly in the Hawaii context, for example, a big part of the stakeholder engagement process design at the commission level. This was sort of, just to sort of take a half step back in the Hawaii context, there was some enabling legislation that was passed to direct the commission to investigate performance-based regulation elements. The commission opened an investigation, and the first phase of that was really centered on identifying those goals, outcomes, or objectives as you described them, Rachel. And we've seen many other states that have wanted to explore the opportunities presented by performance-based regulatory frameworks embark on a very similar process. So I think there's good examples as to how to step through that in conjunction with stakeholders. I think it is important to make that a stakeholder engaged effort. at a commission level, and to really have that kind of iterative dialogue about what is it that we really want to be seeing as sort of outputs and outcomes across our electricity system, and how do we think about how the regulatory framework can enable or help support achievement of those outcomes. And I'll pause there and see if Dan or Eileen wanted to opine on some of the other states that they've experienced. I know Minnesota has gone down similar pathways in terms of setting objectives, Nevada, other states as well. So it is a very common through line in some of these investigations we see across other jurisdictions.
Yeah, and I might add, I think it's an important feature, right? You want your North Star, or in reality, what might be a couple stars, hopefully arrayed in some manner that you can orient to them. In Virginia's case, helpfully or not, maybe depending on your opinion, but the legislation has identified a set of objectives, and commonly, whether it's a commission or legislation, will identify some, but then leave space for iteration on those and refinement. I think that has occurred in this process, but not necessarily as robustly or with as much attention as perhaps other states. But that's okay, perhaps, because it is an iterative process. So, there's been some attempt, I think, by the stakeholders here and in these conversations to, the opportunity to focus or pick which performance areas you want to focus on, and that reveals where priorities are. And that can continue. But most importantly, I suppose what I want to emphasize is it's then very important to kind of have a through line or continued identification of those North Stars, whether from legislation or from the commission. So that can be an exchange that arrives at that. But, I think we've seen the best cases, other states have the agencies or the legislature kind of confirm and really affirm what the PBR structures are meant to achieve, and get a subset of those.
Thank you.
Thank you. And any other questions for the team here? Again, it could be broadly about PBR, or if anyone just needs perspective on how to complete that form as well, you can let us know. Rachel.
Sorry, I don't want to be the only one asking questions, but I feel like I'm pausing a sufficient amount of time if others want to come in. So cut me off if you need to, Larry. Okay. I feel like I also have heard a considerable amount about decoupling, and I think about decoupling particularly in conjunction with energy efficiency. And I'm curious, so decoupling stands out to me as, I hesitate to say critical, but it seems important, and it seems often a component or a tool that's utilized. And so I'm curious if you could speak about the, is decoupling a critical component of a successful PBR informed regulatory framework?
Yeah. Thanks for the question, Rachel. So I think, as we reflect, across jurisdictions that have been tackling, these types of issues and been looking at the development of more comprehensive performance-based regulatory frameworks, we do often see decoupling included in those frameworks. As I think some of the other presenters have pointed out, I think understanding what are the sort of design principles underlying a decoupling mechanism, and decoupling mechanisms can be designed and implemented in a variety of different ways. But I think at the core, the intention typically behind the decoupling mechanism in the abstract is that's intended to address that throughput incentive, and therefore start to de-link the connection between revenues themselves and the variation in actual electricity sales. And I think, as with much of the development of performance-based regulatory framework, you really need to sort of hold some of these mechanisms in balance, typically, as you go forward. So you can start to mitigate and address the throughput incentive, through a mechanism like a decoupling mechanism. Sometimes that may have an impact on the relative sort of risk sharing between a utility and customers, just in terms of just the collection of revenues becomes perhaps more certain on the part of the utility through a decoupling mechanism. And so that sort of risk profile can be looked in a holistic way as you sort of balance it with other mechanisms in the framework as well going forward. But depending on the goals of the jurisdiction, if energy efficiency is an important goal, if there's concerns from jurisdiction around, are there barriers, inherent barriers to utilization of sort of third-party resources like DER in addition to energy efficiency? Those are some of the themes that often come up when jurisdictions are talking around decoupling and its place within a comprehensive framework. I'll pause there to see if my colleagues have anything to add to that as well.
Yeah, I'll chime in. Happy to kind of play second seat to Matt here. And also, Rachel, thank you for your comments. You're making it a little less awkward for us. So we welcome the questions, and maybe others will have them. What I would probably just add or say further on decoupling is, as Matt is saying, it's important to see how these fit together. It is a set of mechanisms that need to work in concert with each other. Specifically with decoupling, it can be a very useful component of incentive regulation, and historically is one of the original players in this space. But it's important to recognize, I think, what it is meant to achieve and what its limitations are. So it removes the throughput incentive if designed well. It does not itself incentivize achievement of efficiency. So, often you want to couple it with whether it's a PIM or just an EERS, a standard or a target or a mandate. Those are some of the supporting features that can work in balance with it. And, I think as greater recognition in a lot of places has occurred to the composition of objectives and affordability or cost containment being a big one. I would call out the decoupling delinks revenue from sales, but it doesn't itself address things like cost containment or capital bias.
Larry, I have another question, but I will pause to see if
I think
others-
you're safe enough.
Just going. Okay. Thank you. I may be misremembering, so if this is not accurate, please correct me. But I thought that part of Hawaii's implementation of their PBR framework, I thought there was a component that did an audit of the utility to try to understand sort of where costs lied, and I thought it resulted in some substantial refund to customers. But I'm curious if that's a standard component, and I actually don't know if it was associated with the PBR rollout or if just sort of happened in close time. So to the extent they're related, I'm curious your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I can speak to that a little bit, Rachel. Yeah, for clarity, the management audit itself was not connected to the PBR framework process and development. It was conducted separately in advance of a rate case that had been filed by the regulated IOU, Hawaiian Electric, in that territory. Some of the findings from that management audit were acknowledged and used to inform some of the going-in rates and some of the opportunity identification for O&M cost savings over the first plan period. But when it comes to management audits, we see a variety of different approaches and sometimes requirements across other jurisdictions. For instance, in Connecticut, for one example, I believe there's a statutory requirement that the commission conduct a management audit on a regular frequency. If memory serves, it's somewhere in the 3 to 4 sort of year period that a management audit is conducted. So it is a tool in the toolkit for many regulators to sort of assess kind of where there may be opportunities for increased efficiencies going forward on the part of the utility. But just to clarify, the Hawaii management audit itself was not directly a part of the PBR framework development. It did though inform some of the features going forward.
Thank you. Okay, that's all I've got. I actually have to go. Not that everyone needed to know that, but since I'm here, I'm just letting you know you won't have more questions from me. But thank you for your time.
Thank you for the questions, Rachel.
Thanks, Rachel. Any other questions? And then I guess I'll throw this out to the group. Is everyone feeling good about getting their form completed for tomorrow? Okay. All right. Well, thank you to GPI and the Current Energy guys. We'll move on here just to our next steps. Right. So as mentioned, tomorrow's the deadline for comments. And we'd appreciate if you could use that exercise template. But if your comments go beyond that, you're also welcome to supply comments in whatever format you wish. And again, our final deadline for our report. Yes, so I see one request there to reshare the form. We can do that in a follow-up email this afternoon. We'll make sure everybody has that. And I think it's also available on the website.
Yes.
Yes, thanks, Jonica. Yep. So actually, Jonica, would you be able just to pop the website link in there in the chat?
Yes.
Thank you. Oh, thank you,
that's
Katja.
all.
Thanks, Katja. All right, so yes, our report, so that's the report of the stakeholder group, is due to the SCC by the 9th of May. We have an internal review process here for everything we submit, so we'll be trying to finish up a couple of weeks before that. And with that, if you go to the next page, Jonica. So we'll have our final meeting of this group on the 22nd of April in the afternoon. I think that's Thursday afternoon. Two things we'll cover in with Virginia Manufacturers Association will present in carbon leakage. That's the presentation that was postponed from today. And then we'll review the draft report. So we'll look to get that draft report out to the group in advance. And the idea of the report is that if we want to, and this meeting, final meeting, if we want to ensure that we've captured the key recommendations and considerations that this group would want to convey to the SCC as they complete their study. And the other element is we want to make absolutely sure that no group or individual's input has been misrepresented in the final report. And just one sort of note on what that report will look like. That the report document itself will not be an exhaustive account of everything that this group has done. But all the inputs that you've provided over the course of these months, all the comment letters, presentations, surveys, assessment exercises, all of that will be transmitted as appendices. So the SCC, they will receive basically everything we've done as a group. And of course, they've been monitoring along with GPI and Current Energy as we've moved through the process as well. So they're fully aware of everything we're doing and have been taking that on board as they work in their side of the report. But before we break for the day, does anyone have any final questions? Okay, well, thank you again. Thanks everyone for your participation, and we'll see you next time.